Okay. Good morning. Good morning. Can you hear me well? Good morning. Good morning. I am Joy Garrett Douglas, the Education and Community Programming Associate at the Dalí Museum. Thank you for joining us for this session of our Coffee with the Curator series. Today, we are joined by my colleague, the Curator of Education at the Dalí, for the opening talk focusing on our new exhibit, Leonora Carrington, Writer, Painter, Visionary. But before we get to the talk, please join me in thanking the City of St. Petersburg for their continued sponsorship and offering a special thanks to all of our members who make events like this possible. Thank you, members. Yeah. Please visit our website, thedalí.org, for more information about our online activities and programming, including these upcoming events. This Thursday, we have our Hispanic Heritage Celebration with Oria, a wonderful group. One of the lead singer, Ona, she is from Spain. She's Catalonian. Then we have workshop, merengue at the Dalí. Last night we had salsa and my legs. I learned a little 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It was great with the Fred Astaire Dance Studios. Amazing people. We had a dancer who is placed 12th in the largest American dance company for competition with Latin dancing. She was amazing. And also on Wednesday, we have art and meditation in the theater. And then at 6, we have the workshop Analog Ideation with Paper Seahorse, another company we work with all the time, and they come frequently and they're amazing. Then Thursday, we have poetry at the Dalí. We also have an innovation lab on Saturday with Dr. Kim McQuarrie, Introduction to Creative Problem Solving. You can find that on our website as well. And then Sunday, we have yoga at the Dalí. We have Sensory Friendly Day, story time at the Dalí, and Dilly Dally with the Dalí. It's a great family-friendly day. Monday the 16th, we have the Art of Collage, a hands-on workshop with Margot Hammond. It was super fun, paper everywhere, the last time she was here for that program. Then the 19th, we have Where Ideas Come From, Creating Music with the ERG in our theater, a wonderful musical performance. Then the 28th, we have our big shebang, our huge party, our fundraiser. We have Sueños at the Dalí. Please make sure you get a ticket while you can before it sells out. And you can find that information on our website as well. Also, our next Coffee with the Curator series, November, we have the Cultural Legacy of Native American Artists with Emily Capes and Ernest Jordan. They're from the James Museum, so come and visit us. Make sure you get a ticket for that sells out as well. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Peter Tush. Peter Tush is the Curator of Education who has thrived here for several decades. Peter is the key interpreter of the collection and special exhibitions. He trains our docents, scripts, our audio guides, directs our school programming, and works with the curatorial team to develop special exhibits. Over the years, he has been a pillar of our Coffee with the Curator program, presenting talks on a wide range of subjects ranging from women and surrealists to our current exhibit, Where Ideas Come From, Dalí's Drawings. Today, for the opening lecture, in conjunction with Leonora Carrington, writer, painter, visionary, this talk will touch on the fantastic and the occult within her writing, painting, and life. Please join me in welcoming Peter.
Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see everybody. Thank you, Joy, for the wonderful introduction. A lot of things going on. Hopefully you'll be able to join us and take advantage of those things. Plenty of great programming. I'm going to be talking to you today about our show in the Raymond James Room, the Leonora Carrington exhibition, writer, painter, and visionary. And before I begin, I just wanted to thank my intern at the time, Mackenzie Turnage, who's here with us, who helped me to really research the show and put this PowerPoint together. So a lot of information we're going to be sharing with you today. Very happy that you are here with us. Leonora Carrington is absolutely fascinating, and I think you will discover why as we go through this. And this is the third in our series of Surrealist Writers in Focus. This is an exhibition that we do between our student shows in the Raymond James Community Room. We do it every fall. We've done two previously. May Césaire 2 years ago had the help of our colleague Bob Devin Jones. It was a wonderful exhibition about the creator of, or one of the original founders of the Negritude movement. He was a poet who was deeply influenced by Surrealism. And then last year we did Paul Eluard, Dalí's compatriot within the Surrealist movement, and also the previous husband of Dalí's partner, Gala. So interesting exhibition. This year we decided to focus on a female who is often thought of just as a painter, and primarily as a painter, but she's an extraordinary writer as well. This is Leonora Carrington. She was a young member of Surrealism, and she has an approach to art where she starts to make it much more broad. So whereas Surrealism was about the unconscious and Freud, she really moves it much more towards the occult and towards feminism. So these are really important ideas to her, and you'll see how that filters through. So a couple key ideas to share right away. She was born in 1917, so she's about 13 years younger than Dalí, if that helps. She was very young when she was affiliated with Surrealism. She was born in England. She has become known very much by people in Mexico as one of their greatest artists. So even though she is a European artist who has eventually wound up in Mexico in her late 20s and early 30s, she stayed there most of her life, and she's really been embraced by Mexico. This is perhaps her best known painting. It was one of her very first paintings that had arrived in a kind of surrealist spirit. It's one called Self-Portrait, or The Inn at the Dawn Horse. And we'll come back to this when that period of time comes. But these are the most powerful themes that recur throughout her work. She often focuses on powerful women and the ideas of feminism. She's fascinated by magical rites, and there's sort of a ritualistic quality to her work. She's deeply indebted to surrealist fantasy, and in particular, Celtic mythology, stories that were shared with her when she was young. She has a very deep and dripping sense of English irony and Black humor. She is a very, very discreet and dry when she shares some of her horror stories. And the kitchen really became her alchemical laboratory. She was both a great cook. She was fascinated by recipes, but also very much given to the idea of magic and the occult, and using the kitchen as a sort of alchemical laboratory. This is perhaps the best known quote by her, and it's a really important one because it'll kind of inform everything about her. "I didn't have time to be anyone's muse. I was too busy rebelling against my family and learning to be an artist." Those two things occupied so much time. Who has time for all these guys around here? You know, she was really about just trying to become Leonora Carrington. And just before we get into exploring her life, I wanted to mention There are very few oil paintings by her in major museums, and there have been very few shows of her work until recently. And so I've got a slide here with many shows listed. The most important one, just to mention to you, is that there was a big show in Copenhagen, and then it went to Madrid. It has since closed, but there's an absolutely wonderful catalog that came along with this that's in English. It's available through Amazon. It's vast, it's filled with information, beautiful reproductions. But I think that these few shows recently, there was one in New York, there's one in Mexico City, they've helped to kind of bring her back into the center of the conversation about surrealism and some of the pathways out and beyond surrealism. And one of the most important details to share with you is that 2 years ago, or last year, 2022, the 59th Venice Biennale, the theme of it was the milk of dreams. And the curator, last year, the curator chose this particular title and this particular theme based on her children's stories, The Milk of Dreams, and the focus on body transformation, which really drives those stories. So she is very much relevant in the world of art, fine art, and conversations about art as recently as 2022. So let's talk a little bit about her as a writer, just very briefly, and then we're going to do a kind of chronological deep dive of some of her amazing stories. In the Paris Review, Tobias Carroll said that although she's best known as a surrealist painter and sculptor, her idiosyncratic literary legacy is equally deserving of attention. Her vivid imagery, irreverence, and surreal transformations are as provocative as they were at the time of the writing. And she really is an extraordinary and strange writer. Her stories are surprising and fascinating. So we do have 4 particular books that we focused on, and they're all featured in the exhibition. The first one is the collected short stories. And really, first and foremost, I think she is an amazing short story writer. She writes these incredibly compelling, magical, and strange short stories that get, in a very short amount of time, deliver a whole lot of unexpected strangeness. And so they are now finally, most of them have been collected in this volume, which is very inexpensive and easy to find. It's a recent publication. Also, she wrote one of the most compelling books associated with surrealism, which was the Down Below. And this is a memoir of her horrors that she experienced when she was in a Spanish asylum. And for about a year, she was in that asylum. We'll talk about that when we get to it. But Andre Breton was so taken with her stories, he's the one who encouraged her to set it down into print. She tried writing several times, really failed, just couldn't do it. And then finally, she dictated the stories to a colleague who wrote them down, and that was the publication in 1943. So it's a remarkable, harrowing story of madness, and it's very clear the moments where it slips into madness as a voice. So it's not someone saying, I shouldn't have been there, that was a terrible thing. It's more like, this is the way we treat people who are suffering from things that I'm experiencing very deeply. In the 1950s, she wrote a book called The Hearing Trumpet. It's her first and only novel, and it wasn't published until 1976, so it took 26 years before the written piece was finally brought to print. It is a novel of true strangeness. Again, we will talk about that when we come to it. And the last story that, or the last book that I want to share with you is The Milk of Dreams, which is an absolutely lovely and once again strange collection of short stories that she shared with her children when they were very young. And apparently she would write the stories in a notebook, she did drawings in the notebook, and then she translated the art onto the walls of their 2 bedrooms. So the kind of drawings that you see here, these kind of magical, strange, almost Dr. Seussian type of magic creatures, very much were a part of her children's childhood. And the one thing I wanted to mention is that we do have excerpts from all 4 of these books on our audio guide. So if you're curious about the tone, what it sounds like, what how different each one of these books are, we have 2 readers. We have Sharon Emery, one of our colleagues here at the Dalí, and also Rita Risco, one of our docents, have done the English and Spanish translations. We shared the story, The Debutante, is in its entirety. It takes about 4 minutes. We have a short excerpt from the children's book, Humbert the Beautiful. We have a few excerpts from her book Down Under about the experience that she went through in the asylum. And finally, there's the first page that's shared in the book, her novel, The Hearing Trumpet. So you have opportunities to hear and listen to passages from all four of these books. So let's dive into her life. She was born, as I said, in 1917. She was born in Lancashire, England, very, very wealthy family. Her father was a textile mill owner, doing extremely well, very, very prosperous at a particular moment in time. Very much nouveau riche is the really important thing, not landed gentry, but wealthy with the Industrial Revolution. He was very, very determined to be accepted in society. Her mother was Irish, and both of them were really first-generation money. Both of them were born into humble origins, but when they were raising their own family, there was a great expectation for them to arrive as a family. And so this is the house that they rented for a number of years through most of her childhood. This is where she lived, grew up, had her nanny, and it's extraordinary and also extraordinarily cold. It was not a place of great warmth or delicacy. Everything was very much a traditional kind of upper crust English lifestyle, minus perhaps the sense of being planted there permanently. So there was a great difficulty with that. The person who was both perhaps the most respected, but at the same time terribly feared, and the source of her rebellion was her father. Her father did not understand her. He had incredibly great expectations of her that went along with class and society, and her whole life in a way was spent rebelling against him and trying to establish her own identity. And it really becomes a battle between the two of them that escalates through most of her youth. She would find art and the imagination as an opportunity, a respite from all of this, an escape. And I just wanted to share this page. It's really lovely. She created a whole book of this kind of these mysterious creatures from these magical places. This particular one is a Horiptus, I guess would be the way you would pronounce it. Looks a little bit like a giraffe with several other things mixed in. It says, found on the northwest coast of Tava, and it feeds on millet oil seeds. And she has a whole book of these kind of strange creatures that she imagined. And I think this really comes to play when she has her children and she starts to share her stories with her children. She has this great quote that I think really informs everything about her work. She says, that kind of feeling in childhood of being mysterious, do you think anybody ever escapes childhood? I don't think we ever do. And I think that really it can be seen in her work from the very beginning to the very end, as there's a mystery about it that seems to be that kind of youthful naivete of wonder that she continually tapped into. Now, in her family, she was one of 4 children, 3 boys and her. She had a great difficulty with this because they often separated themselves based on gender. So lots of things were available to the boys that were not available to her. They didn't often play together. She felt very much isolated within this large family. Apparently, the 3 boys were sent to boarding school. She remained home for most of that period of time. So when they were in boarding school, she was on her own. And then finally, when she was sent to boarding school, she attended several Catholic schools, 2 of which expelled her very quickly. From her perspective, it was because she was not collaborative. From the Mother Superior's perspective, it's that she was neither capable of study nor play. So she was very much a kind of broken child from the perspective of the Mother Superior. And then after returning home, her mother kind of created a sort of solace by giving her a very expensive set of watercolors, which she really enjoyed. She did enjoy some of the aspects of this kind of upper crust lifestyle. She loved her horses. She loved riding. What she didn't love was the kind of gendered expectations for what's allowed and not allowed to females who are part of this, and also these roles of social restrictions that she kept encountering. So parts of this, obviously, having horses, having them available, it was her greatest delight, but there was a cost that she recognized. Now, the really important story that says everything about her youth is that it was decided that she would be brought out as a debutante at one of these society presentations that was held by King George V. All wealthy families were able to participate if you were invited. And what it would require is that you would go to London, you would probably rent a flat for a season, and while you were there, you go to all the right shops to get the right clothing for a series of different displays, I suppose might be the right word, tea parties, presentations, meeting, and then finally, the ultimate one is the presentation at King George's V debutante ball. And this was what everything was focusing on. It was all about finding the right family to marry the right debutante. And her father was really, I think, counting on this, leading to her being someone else's problem, and at the same time, a kind of wealthy respectability in their family that she would be married into the right family. This to her, she was probably a willing participant initially, but as it went on, it became incredibly grueling to the point where she was horrified by all of the things that she experienced. It led to this amazing story that's one of the stories we share on the audio guide called The Debutante. It's a kind of shocking story. It's a story about a girl who meets a hyena at the zoo, as one does. They start a conversation. The hyena decides that it would be fun to go to a ball, so they change places. And then at the dreaded ball, the maid is eaten, the hyena has bad manners, it just kind of ruins the party. So there's it's very flatly told. It is a wonderful story, and it really does get to the quick of it, what she was disgusted by with this kind of world that she was trapped in. So as it's pointed out again in the Paris Review, nonchalance in the face of the weird is the hallmark of her fiction. So if that sounds intriguing to you, I definitely encourage you to find the book of collected stories. So clearly, and not surprisingly, her father's disappointed. She has not made the right choices as far as he's concerned. But because of her mother's intervention, she is able to study art. And so she goes briefly to Italy. She goes to Florence and studies there. Then for another 6 months, she comes to Paris. And then finally, when she's about 16 to 17 years old, she comes back to London. She briefly is in one academy, and then she is sent to a brand new school, which really, I think, was the key to what became Leonora Carrington. She was able to study with Amédée Ozenfant, who's a French artist, part of the Cubist movement. He opened a brand new thing called the Academy of Fine Arts. It was really like an old barn that he had purchased as a place where he could teach art. He was in London, and there were like 2 or 3 students when she started there. So it was right at the beginning. He was a very strict disciplinarian. He made sure that they repeated processes over and over and over again. And it's really what made her capable to become the visual artist that she later did. Just as a passing aside, the artists that she fell in love with were Netherlandish artists like Hieronymus Bosch and 15th century early Renaissance, Italian Renaissance artists like Uccello. So she liked the symbolic quality of that, she liked the flatness, and she explored and really mastered tempera. So tempera paint, which is the kind that you would mix with the linseed oil and with egg whites in order to create this kind of vivid color, is what she mastered. And it's very difficult and very much about like kind of preparing recipes. This is her when she's 19. She's starting to obviously come into her own, be very focused on her art and herself. This is an example of a series she did early on called The Sisters of the Moon. And there were, I think, 12 of these. This is Fantasia and Iris, 2 of these strong female figures, which becomes very important to her later. And in 1936, she had a surprise, which was that her mother purchased for her this new book on Surrealism by Herbert Reed. She also had the chance to go to London to see the International Surrealist exhibition that opened that year. That's the same exhibition where Dalí gave the lecture in the diving suit, the deep sea diving suit. And it was really important because here she is, a very young girl, 19 years old, and she's seeing art that feels very familiar to her, very much from the world that she's been escaping to, and she suddenly feels like there's an audience for what she loves. There are other people, so to speak. She also sees this particular painting, which she becomes completely fascinated by. It was like she understood everything about this painting immediately, called Two Children Menaced by a Nightingale by Max Ernst. And of course, what happens, and this is what's interesting, is that because of her time at that academy in London, a good friend of hers who was studying there invited her to a dinner party. At that same dinner party, they had also invited Max Ernst to join them. And when they're at this dinner party, they meet each other, they fall in love, And for about a week, they keep seeing each other. And it becomes deeper and richer and more powerful. There is 26 years difference between the two of them. So she's 20 at this point, he's 46, but he's completely taken by her and she's completely taken by him. And so this kind of whirlwind romance starts. When her father found out about it, he was horrified. Not only was this a much older man, but he was married. And, this was obviously the worst thing that could possibly happen to a society figure. And so he immediately goes to talk to the authorities. They put out a warrant for his arrest. And when they discover this, it's like, things are going to get bad. So, and briefly, this is his wife from the previous decade. She was also younger than him, but very close initially. And then she became a converted Catholic and became incredibly strained as a relationship. So he had had a number of affairs prior to meeting Carrington, but Max was given to the description of being a real romancer, very handsome, very suave, and so it was inevitable that seemingly she would, find him attractive. And they had some friends who were actually going for a holiday down to Cornwall. So while this warrant was put out for his arrest, they immediately decided, hey, let's join our friends, go to Cornwall. And it turned out to be a 4-week-long party. And many people came. Man Ray showed up with his girlfriend, Adi. Paul Eluard, the poet, shows up with his wife, Noosh. Lee Miller is there with her partner. Lots and lots of stuff is going on. Everybody's having a great time. It is a love nest of sorts. It's very important. This is where their commitment to one another really grows and becomes incredibly distinct. And I'm just going to briefly mention that within the group of Surrealism, there is definitely this ideal called la femme enfant, or the child girl, the child woman. And as André Breton says, woman is the most marvelous and disturbing problem in the world. So romance and love is constantly what they seek as their grail. And the idea is sort of an Alice in Wonderland sort of story where what the male creative surrealist artists are looking for are these young muses, these women who can inspire and reach the unconscious quickly and share with them all of the most important ideas so they can become the great male artists. That's sort of the outlook of surrealism. And that's what this photograph is about, which was taken in Cornwall. These are 4 of the partners of several of the surrealists. Leonora Carrington is right at the very bottom. They all have their eyes closed. They are these young muses who are connected to the unconscious and sharing all the ideas that they're experiencing with their male partners. But this goes back to this point, I did not have time to be anyone's muse. She really was focused on her art. And so this idea of becoming one of these young women who's supposedly inspiring the great male artists, it just wasn't really holding weight with her. So she did say that everything she learned about art, she learned from Max Ernst. Everything she learned about moving forward, she completely was fascinated by anything he shared with her. But there really was this instruction and period of learning that was a big part of their relationship. So he returns to Paris, and very shortly she finds a way to join him. They suddenly are amongst all the surrealists. André Breton is there holding forth at the Du Magot. She's joining Ernst, and they're surrounded by people like Dalí and Duchamp and Picasso, and she's really well received. She does not participate in these major conversations, but she is definitely there in this kind of milieu, and she feels very welcomed and very excited about it, but she's not signing the manifestos. She is not participating in these revolutionary protests and activities, but she's kind of learning and observing. And this is when she paints her first major work, the self-portrait of the Inn of the Dawn Horse, where she's in conversations with the hyena, which we already are introduced to with her short story, The Debutante. She seems very androgynous. She does not seem quite feminine in the way that she's presented in some of the photos. She remembers a particular rocking horse that she has placed on the back wall, which her father used as an example. It's not quite clear, but maybe he burned it at some point to show to her his power. That's not clear, but she uses that in one of her short stories. And then that same horse is now fleeing out into freedom outside of the window. And there's that sense of containment, being somewhat trapped, but at the same time, opportunities and possibilities for the strange to intervene and lead to other outcomes. She also, amazingly, at the age of 21, was included in the International Surrealist Exhibition in Paris. This was really the last major exhibition. Many artists were included, but this is where Dalí's Rainy Taxi was. There were extraordinary works by Max Ernst, and she was also represented with a piece. So lots of things were going on in Paris, but of course, Paris is also where Max Ernst's wife lived. And she was getting very upset. And she made a couple very public demonstrations against Leonora, at one point hurling a lot of plates at her at a particular outdoor bar. I guess, I don't know how much she hurt Carrington, but Carrington said she got in a good punch as well. Lots of it went bad. They realized they needed to get out of there quickly. And so what they did is they moved south. So they, 1939, they moved to Saint Martin d'Ardèche. And it's this lovely sort of farm community. They purchased this one particular farmhouse on the outcropping of the community. And they really don't integrate. That's probably the most important thing to say. They are definitely hedonists. They are living a kind of wild lifestyle. They purchase this place, they build it up. They become somewhat recognized by the townspeople, and they're able to interact with them, but they're not really embraced by the community. But while they live there, they create this incredible little palace for themselves. And they decorate it. You can see some of the decorations on the outside. These are some photos when Lee Miller visits them. They're truly deeply in love. This is like a perfect, idyllic, utopian moment in their lives, kind of following up on the period in Cornwall. Here's a photo of Max with his mermaid and her with one of her dragons that she painted on the wall. Here they are entertaining some of their friends, just like they did in Cornwall. So definitely this was seen as a place that was really enjoyable, but not so, and it's also where they do these two portraits of each other that later they exchange when they come to New York. And finally, she creates this painting that's very much like her self-portrait with all these kind of magical horses, going back to her love of horses. There's even a horse that's within a tree. Peggy Guggenheim actually visits, expecting to purchase a work by Max Ernst. She sees this work and she finds it more compelling. And this is the first work that Peggy buys by either Max or Leonora. So it's kind of an interesting start to Peggy's legacy in their lives. Of course, what happens though, at the end of 1939, war breaks out. And first, Max is incarcerated by the French police because he's non-native. He's an alien. They see him as a threat. He is incarcerated, even though he had fought everything he could to run away from Germany, to protest against Germany, to be part of the, the wave of I want to say just more protests. Everything he had done up until this point had been about his disgust of his country, but that wasn't recognized. He was thrown in jail, and over a period of time, it took a lot of different voices orchestrated by Paul Eluard to finally get his release. So during this period of time, several months, definitely Leonora was having great difficulty. She still had not mastered French. She's kind of left alone. She's 21 years old. She's doing a lot of suffering, but she is able to visit him several times a week. And so they do spend time together. And then finally he's released. And very quickly after that, Paris falls. Germany comes in. He's arrested by the Germans, by the Gestapo. And he is incarcerated in a pretty serious prison at this point, and she no longer sees him at all. And this becomes a period of time that lasts about 4 or 5 months, and she really does start to go out of her mind. She has a breakdown. She can't quite cope properly. She starts to lose weight, and eventually she's visited by a friend, and her friend convinces her to come with her to Madrid to get the hell out of France. Things are going very bad. She sells the house for very little money. She stores the paintings. She takes Max's visa because she doesn't know if she'll ever see him again, but she doesn't want to leave his visa. And she goes to Madrid. After great difficulty getting into Spain, she starts to have hallucinations. And in particular, she has these paranoid visions of how the war is connected with dietary restrictions and particular ways that somehow she is involved in the outcome of the war, and she needs to change certain things. She tries to go to the Madrid authorities to talk about what's happening. She actually winds up being raped by this group of soldiers, and she has another breakdown. So very bad period of time. Her parents are told about this horrifying situation, and they immediately arrange for her to be incarcerated. There's an asylum in northern Spain that's was considered by many fine families as the place to take your family member who might be seemingly acting weird or strange or unusual. And so it was probably not seen by the family as a terrible place. It was probably seen as a refuge where she would get better. Of course, that wasn't the case. It was a place where they definitely used shock therapy, and they also employed the drug called cardiazol, which creates a kind of epileptic seizure in dealing with schizophrenia. And she talks about this in her book. This is really the focus of her book, Down Under. She says, "A new era began with the most terrible, blackest day of my life. How can I write this when I'm afraid to think about it? I'm in terrible anguish, yet I cannot continue living alone with such a memory. I know that once I've written it down, I shall be delivered. But shall I ever be able to express in mere words the horror of that day?" And it is a horrifying story. It's very traumatic, it's very powerful, and yet it's not written in a way of trying to elicit pity. It's told in a very objective, uncomfortably rational and distanced sort of way. But it's a powerful story that she shares. And the story goes that in 1941, so after about a year, her parents are told that she's ready to be released. So they send her nanny that she grew up with, and she decides she is not going to go back to her parents no matter what. She is not she's not going to go back to that prison. And so the nanny has to return home without Leonora. The parents then decide that the only thing to do with their daughter is to send her to a South African asylum. If she's going to be released from this one, we need to send her to a better asylum. So they arrange for her to be transported to South Africa. And then things get strange, because on the way through Lisbon, which would have gotten them to South Africa, she encounters someone she recognizes, a Mexican diplomat named Renato Leduc. He's very handsome, a bit older than her. She was introduced to him through Pablo Picasso, and he had even been a dinner guest at their house when she was with Max. So she remembers him. She sees him in this lobby while she's being transported, and she speaks to him in French so that the person transporting her doesn't understand. And she basically explains what's happening. And this gentleman amazingly says, "We need to find some way for you safely to get out of here. Let's get married so you can get the card and you can be released from Europe." And what they decide to do, she sneaks out in transport the next day. She sneaks out, goes to the Mexican embassy. They meet together and they arrange, basically, they're going to get married, and then they're going to be able to leave from Spain or from Lisbon. So lots of complications, but this work actually does work. It succeeds. And in Lisbon, while she's waiting, André Breton publishes this book called the Black Anthology of Black Humor. She's one of the only two female writers that's included, and it's that story, The Debutante, along with 42 other writers. And it's like she has been accepted into the realms of surrealism. And again, she's at this point 23 years old. She also, while wandering in Lisbon, waiting for the opportunity to get married, because everybody's trying to arrange for bureaucratic procedures, it takes incredibly long. It's like Casablanca. Everybody's waiting for papers. So while you're waiting for papers in Lisbon, you wander, and she encounters Max. Out of the blue. She didn't ever think she'd ever see him again. Turns out that Max, over the period of time since she last saw him, had finally won his freedom from the Gestapo and was able to be released. And he winds up meeting Peggy Guggenheim, very wealthy American heiress, and basically they become a couple. And so he is with Peggy. She's about to get married to Renato Leduc, and they're in Lisbon, and it just becomes this sort of strange parade of their affections. He's madly, deeply in love with her. She's extremely confused and somewhat broken after her experience in the asylum. They're both with other partners, and things just proceed. So Peggy, I think, is very hurt by Max's affection for Leonora Carrington, but she lets it continue. And so finally, they both get released from Europe about the same time. They're able to arrange for separate transport. They arrive in New York, and they're in the same world again. So she meets Max again. They get together. They exchange those two portraits that they made of one another. She spends a little bit of time with him, but she's also now amongst Marcel Duchamp and Yves Tanguy and André Masson, André Breton. She's right back amongst all these men that she remembered from Paris. And she's very well accepted. Peggy Guggenheim opens her gallery, The Art of the Century. And if you look down in the very bottom, that's the painting that she had purchased of Leonora Carrington. She's front and center in this gallery of all these male surrealist artists. She also is moving around in society. She meets Helena Rubinstein's sister, who commissions her to do a mural. She immediately accepts and then realizes she doesn't have the money to purchase the materials she needs. So very strange story, but after going first to, I think, who was it? Well, she went to one artist who said, "You're a good artist, continue working, but no, I'm not going to give you anything." André Breton gives her the sheet from his bed. That's what this is on. And she's actually able to get not only Max Ernst, but Marcel Duchamp and Roberto Matta to assist her to complete this in time for Rubinstein's sister, Manca. And they deliver it, and she is super excited and pleased. So here she is, 23 years old, and yet she's getting commissions to do work, and she's able to also kind of orchestrate some of the key names in surrealism to assist her on these projects. So everything's going, I think, pretty well for her for a young woman. This is a photograph of her with not only Max Ernst, but also Marcel Duchamp and André Breton. So she's definitely traveling in the right circles. And I think the photo that really gives you the sense of this moment when things could have gone even better is that she's included in this photo at Peggy Guggenheim's apartment of the emigres. And everybody that Varian Fry was able to help get out of Europe seems to be included in this photograph. There's not only Breton and Duchamp, but there's also Pierre Mondrian, there's Fernand Léger, lots and lots of people, Bernice Abbott. But Leonora Carrington is in the front, right at the very second from the left, and seems very confident. You know, I think she feels like she belongs. And the final painting, just to share with you before she goes to Mexico, is this really curious one called Green Tea. It's owned by the Museum of Modern Art. And you have this very curious kind of cowhide straitjacket that the woman is wearing. Definitely the landscape is based on the landscape of the house where she originally grew up in. You have these horses that are very maternal and fraternal, that seem to be tethered to this tree very tightly. And then there's sort of monsters underneath the very, very base of the painting, where you can start to see underneath the grass, there's these hollows and there's strange monsters and bats and creatures. It gives you that sense that the sinister is always just within a breath away. And this is when basically she agrees with her husband, it's probably time to leave New York. And they decide to go to Mexico, where his career is sort of waiting, because he's a Mexican diplomat, he's got opportunity. And that leads us to Mexico, which turned out to be in 1942 a really good place for Europeans, because their president, Cardenas, had basically opened the doors and said, if you're a European emigre, we would love to have you come to Mexico. And so Mexico City becomes a real destination for a lot of people displaced by the war. While they're down there, even though there's some evidence that she really did fall in love with her husband, he still had this practice of constantly living his own life, leaving her a lot of times to go out with his friends, just not really being very attentive to her. And I think they both decided that it just wasn't working out as a relationship, and so they got divorced, but they did keep in contact throughout her entire life. But so they got divorced, and this is the period of time when she does write the memoir, Down Below. So 3 years after the incidents occurred, she finally sets it down as a kind of purging of the experience. And it's published in 1943. It's just a remarkable, remarkable story. So now she's in Mexico City, she's on her own, and she winds up encountering a few of these people from this sort of displaced European community, and two women in particular become her best friends for an entire decade. And that's Remedios Varo and the Hungarian photographer Katie Horna. And they become a trio. They constantly gather together in each other's kitchen, exploring recipes, exploring the occult, reading the tarot. They are completely and totally dedicated to each other as being a very powerful trio. And it's around this time that Leonora Carrington paints this work called The Temptation of St. Anthony from 1945. And this was painted for the same competition that Dalí did his Temptation of St. Anthony, and also that Max Ernst won with his Temptation of St. Anthony. It's a really powerful piece. It's inspired by Hieronymus Bosch. There's some very curious things, including the little face of the three figures within the body of the hermit. And this piece wound up selling recently at Sotheby's 2014 for $2.5 million. Throughout her life, even though she had good representation, she never saw prices like this. It's really discouraging. I mean, that's the story of every artist pretty much. But, you know, her work is now selling at the appropriate costs. She does have this great quote saying that, "I always had access to other worlds. Like we all do, we all sleep, we all dream." Even though she was never central in the Surrealist movement, this aspect of Surrealism and dreams and walking through the dreams is something she always tapped into. And through her friends, she wound up meeting a gentleman named Chiki. And this is Americo Chiki Weiss. He was a Hungarian photographer. He was part of this exiled European community that she wound up finding herself within. Turned out he was best friends, lifelong friends with Robert Capa. And if you're familiar with the photo on the right, considered to be probably the #1 photo capturing the flavor of what the Spanish Civil War was all about, he's the one who took it. They were both photographers. Chiki wound up staying in Paris. Robert Capa went to Spain. He would send his negatives to Chiki, and Chiki would get them to all the publishers. So they were very much working as a team, just Robert Capa was on the front lines capturing it. And just a brief aside, there was a huge, dossier of negatives that seemingly have disappeared forever. And it was discovered, I think, at the Mexican consulate. I might be wrong about that. But Chiki had this huge cache of negatives by Capa that he had stowed away and kept safe for decades until finally it was right time for them to be discovered again. So he really helped in preserving the career and the legacy of Robert Capa. They get married. Leonora said that she was not deeply in love with Chiki, but she could imagine having a family with him. And it was very much a first time ever that she met an equal, someone who was as supportive of her and her goals as she was of him. And it was a very rich marriage. It was very important for both of them. And they plugged into this group, this community. Remedios Varo is in the right next to Leonora. Benjamin Perret, the poet who was her partner, is right above. And then this other group of Hungarian artists and photographers. And this is the period of time when she discovers the white goddess. So 1948, after she's married, she reads this book by Robert Graves, changes her world and her outlook immediately. She suddenly has this incredible passion, which occupies her for the rest of her life, a goal, a mission, and it's to understand and basically educate about the idea that originally society was developed as a matriarchy, that over time was suppressed by the patriarchal wills of males, and eventually the white goddess disappeared. And so by reading this book, she suddenly had a different insight into women, the goals of women as a group, and also how she could contribute. So she started doing work very much focused on the ideas that come from this book. She also meets a very important person who we might be familiar with. This is Edward James. And if you remember Edward James, he was Dalí's great patron at the end of the 1930s. He had relocated to Mexico and was creating a kind of tropical dream palace over on the coast, and he meets Leonora. Their backgrounds are very similar. They were both raised in great wealth and also great austerity and coldness, not a lot of warmth or love in either of their lives. And so they became great compatriots, allies, and he commissions her to do one of her really most important works. Now in the Irish Museum, it's called The Giantess, which kind of shows what she got from reading the goddess. This is a celebration of the female goddess as a kind of naive child woman who also towers over the landscape and has birds and life within her robes. So it's a really powerful piece, and it was commissioned by James. And then he went one step further, and he worked with the gallery owner in New York, Pierre Matisse, to arrange for the very first Leonora Carrington exhibition. There was about 20 paintings in this show, several of them owned by Edward James, but the show was very well received, it was well reviewed, and even Greta Garbo wound up owning a Leonora Carrington painting. Carrington really liked always remaining in the background, but suddenly she couldn't anymore. And this painting sort of addresses that. It's called The Artist Traveling Incognito, where there's a couple details here that don't quite match up, where it's all costume and pageantry, but she definitely didn't want to be in the spotlights, but she was thrust in the spotlight almost immediately. So moving back to Mexico, or focusing back on Mexico, this is when she really develops this great relationship with her friends, Ramita Esfaro and Katie Horna. It says here that the three women had a riotous time together. Kafkaesque sense of humor pervaded these gatherings. The three of them fed off each other's imagination. They indulged in curiously surreal and outrageously mischievous activities, like inviting random strangers from the telephone directory to come to dinner to see what would happen. I love that idea. I think that's just incredible. They would experiment with weird recipes in the kitchen, like omelets made of human hair. And they would create like caviar created from dyed tapioca for unsuspecting guests. So they were definitely pranksters and mischievous, as well as seekers of knowledge. And I think that's definitely a way to understand the three of them. And then, of course, the great moment in her life is having children. So Pablo and Gabe are her two children. Here's a great photograph of her. Apparently, when she had her two children, her work became, her paintings in particular, became just welling out like this outpouring of work. She was able to work better nursing and holding and trying to, take care of two children than she had been previously when she was unoccupied and undistracted by them. So her work always came first, but the children were absolutely the focus of her entire being. Here's a great photo I just wanted to share. This is a Three King moment where everyone's dressed. Leonora is the one on the right-hand side, and Chiqui's next to her. And then I think one of their sons, Gabe, is the one on the bottom right. But there was a great theatricality and mask making and enacting plays in the family. And this is where you come to the children's stories, The Milk of Dreams, which she had originally written in this notebook, but she would paint these wonderful images on the walls of her children's bedrooms, and that's all brought together in this book. So it's really fun and very strange. I don't know if it should be shared with children, but it didn't seem to hurt her kids very much. And you can listen to Humberto the Beautiful next door, and you get a flavor of what the book's about. This is one of the really powerful works that she did, also in the MoMA collection, called And Then We Saw the Daughter of the Minotaur. So it almost starts in kind of literary way where you're in media res, something is happening, and it's her two sons that are here at this kind of oracular seance that's being conducted by this flower woman. And then the Minotaur just happens to turn out and see us entering into the room. There's this curious dancer down the hallway in the back. It all has a sense of ritual, of something strange that we're not supposed to see, but we've entered into. And definitely it's kind of education of her children into magic and dreams. Another quote by her, I'm as mysterious to myself as I am to others. It is notorious that she hated to talk to anyone ever about her art, the meaning behind it. She would shut an interviewer down in a blink of an eye if they started to ask her about the meaning of the work. She would just be so condescending about it, but she didn't want to talk about it. It's like the meaning to her was to be interpreted by each individual on their own. She didn't feel that was an important part of the process. She also was not great with her own gallery shows. She would rarely attend. She would really maintain a distance, but over time, she became really central to the whole Mexican understanding of modern art. And she's a big part of that world. So just to move us towards the end, in the 1960s in Mexico, things do change pretty radically. This is a photograph of her around that period of time. She is going for psychoanalysis, and I just love this portrait because this is her psychoanalyst, and he seems to be surrounded by all of the demons and beasts and figures from her own magical world. It's like he's just sort of introducing her to some of the ways to talk about them, but he seems very much to have fallen victim to all of these visions that she has, where she has placed them in as one of the, sort of one of the captured characters within her imaginary world. But by 1963 to 64, she had risen to such a point of respect that Mexico, which has a long legacy of having mural painters do great murals about their history, she was hired by the National Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City to do a large mural about the Mayan people. And she took it very seriously. And she spent about a year living with indigenous communities that go back to the Mayan ancestry. She did a lot of time researching, and she spent time with several key anthropologists to collect the stories and the mythology and the folklore that really animated that culture. And she tried to capture it in this really amazing painting. I believe it's about 12 to 13 feet across from 1964, called The Magical World of the Mayans. And it says, she was commissioned to do it. She spent time staying at Chiapas, and she divided the work onto 3 levels representing the kingdoms of the Mayan world. The Mayans combined with images of the Popol Vuh and observations of the customs and traditions of the Mayan people. So she took it very seriously, and she created her own visionary language to share the story. But now as we move to the end of the 60s, there's something some of you may remember, which is I will get this word wrong, I've practiced it so many times, Tlatelolco massacre. Right at the 1968 Olympics, as it was gearing up in Mexico City, there were large protests happening by students. The president decided he had had enough of this, and he ordered his soldiers to basically open fire. It was the Tiananmen Square of 1968. Many, many students were killed, over 300 they're pretty sure of, and it was this breaking point. I think the Mexican people really saw their government as having betrayed them. And all of these students were unarmed, and they were all rounded up. Many of them disappeared afterwards, many of the ones who had survived. And it was very clear the level of corruption that was present within the Mexican government. So her sons were both at the university at this time, who were probably instigators in the protests. She became very deeply connected. She also joined the protests and started being very public in her denouncement of the government. And then she heard through an anonymous source, she's been targeted. The government's very aware of what she's saying. And so almost overnight, she flees Mexico with her 2 sons. She goes to first New Orleans, and then she goes to New York. And for about the next 2 decades, 25 years, she lives mostly in New York City, sometimes in Chicago. She would go back down to Mexico to visit with some frequency. She even lived for a while outside of Mexico City, trying to set up a commune. But, she spends a lot of time in the States for the next 2 decades. But during this period of time, she does this amazing poster for the Mexican women's movement of 1972. And this is the period of time when her book is finally published, dealing with ecofeminism, called The Hearing Trumpet. So The Hearing Trumpet is her one and only novel, written as early as 1950. That's the thing I just find amazing. This is when she's raising her children. But what's amazing about it, it's really about aging. Her character is a 92-year-old woman. She finds out right at the beginning through this hearing trumpet gift that her kids are planning to send her off to a nursing home. And she more or less deals with that fine. She goes there, she finds these women who she thinks are all sort of incarcerated, and then she slowly learns they're kind of a secret society who are seeking the Grail, and she gets really invested in their travels. And so there's a murder mystery that happens. There's this idea about the patriarchy needing to be replaced by the matriarchy. There's even a kind of eco-mysticism crisis where there's an apocalypse towards the end, where the earth is, frozen. And it's a really unusual novel. That's the most important takeaway. It's very full of ideas. And so finally, this is published in the 70s. In the New York Times, it says that this 1974 novel, The Hearing Trumpet, newly reissued, stands out as something of the last truly radical undoing, not only of our expectations of time and space, but the psyche and its boundaries. A mind-flaying masterpiece held together by Carrington's gift of wit, imagination, and suspense. It's not universally described that way, but some writers definitely connect with the story. Shortly after that, next decade, she is given the honor of receiving an award for lifetime achievement by the Women's Caucus of Art in the convention in New York City. Very, very prestigious recognition of where her life has built towards these important representations of women that are powerful and respect of aging. And I just wanted to show you this. This is called The Crone Flower from that same year. Very curious, very almost humorous presentation of these aged women who have a kind of cabal. It's like keeping on that group that she had with Varro and with Horna, where they're continuing their magic spells. In 1992, she finds out that Cheeky has become ill. She returns to Mexico, and she pretty much remains there for the rest of her life. Mexico becomes her source for the last decade. That said, in 1995, she had the opportunity to come to Tampa. And in graphic studio, working under the direction of our current director, Hank Hine. Hank was in charge of graphic studio as the director. They worked together, and she created a series of prints. She did this one called The Memory Tower, which was published almost right away. And then she did a series of 5 more prints that were a series called Beasts, Ox, Flight, Snake, Cave, and Taper. It was published in 1998, but created at the same time. And what's really interesting, so she did these images, and these are poems by her son, her poet son, who found words for the images that she created. And then this was brought out as a suite in 1998. And we're able to show that whole suite in the exhibition. So very finally, to wrap it up, recognition and passing. In 2000, she received the Order of the British Empire Award, which seems really long overdue in some respects, but also a bit strange. It says several places that it was presented by Queen Elizabeth II, and I've read everywhere and I can't find, did she attend a service? Was there a ceremony? Was it just like, oh yeah, that person down in Mexico, we're giving her this? I don't know how it was awarded, but she did receive this very prestigious award in 2000. Also in 2000, one of her great sculptures was made into a massive scale and was presented right in the middle of Mexico City on the Paseo de Reforma Avenue. So kind of a Lewis Carroll crocodile sort of image, very, very fun and very appropriate. Since then, her house, and this is the kitchen in her house, which was both the kitchen, it was also where she did her painting, and it's also where she would conduct these sort of occult gatherings with her friends. So very much the center of her universe. Her house has become a museum. And her son has also seen to it that in 2018, a particular museum has opened in the center of the arts, the San Luis, Potosi Center of the Arts in Mexico. So this is also open. You can see a few of the sculptures. There's a lot of drawings that are included in the room. And just to wrap it up, unfortunately, she died of pneumonia in 2011 at the age of 94. So remarkable, remarkable life. She is buried in the Panteon Britannia, which is the English cemetery in Mexico City. And I just want to get to this one slide here. There's a book called Surreal Spaces. It was written by her second cousin, Joanna Moorhead. It's been the source of a lot of the information I shared. It has just been published, I believe this year, after an earlier version of her biography. It has extraordinary stories, but the most extraordinary of all is that the second cousin, who was studying to be an art historian, while she was working, she went to a party, she met a woman from Mexico. They were talking about different artists and art movements, and she said, you know, there's a person in my family that I always heard stories about who wound up in Mexico. She was supposed to be an artist. Have you ever heard of her? Leonora Carrington. And the woman just looks at her and probably very quietly continues to look at her and just says, you know, Leonora Carrington is one of the most important people in Mexico City. She is beloved by all. She is one of the great painters. What do you mean, do I know her? And that led to almost a decade of being able to visit, first meet, and win the trust of her second cousin, and over time just collect some of the most amazing stories about Leonora Carrington, her plight, and her accomplishments. And so that's what's shared in this particular biography. Amazing. And then there's also this book that was on the New York bestsellers list, Leonora in the Morning Light, which is basically about that period of time of the asylum and the escape as a kind of dramatized novel. So it's really great fun. It's great reading. If you're looking for more about Leonora, these are 2 great sources. And with that, I thank you all very much for coming today. Hope you enjoy the show. And I know it's late. If anybody has any questions or whatever, I'll be up front. Just feel free to come forward and I'll speak. But thank you.